Okay, tonight we are going to cover Historic Designation 101. My name is Zachary Burt, and I'm the Community Outreach and Grants Manager at the DC Preservation League. This is a topic I'm very interested in, so I'm excited to share some information with all of you tonight. First of all, before we get into it, we have to ask why designate a property, a building, a structure, a site? Many preservationists would argue that it helps maintain a sense of place. A sense of place is really, what makes a historic site or a historic neighborhood or building unique. And also that place attachment, that place meaning that people associate with the particular place. Designation allows for community involvement in managing change through preservation. Preservation is often viewed as one of many types of planning tools, so preservationists and planners work together. Designation ensures compatibility and minimizes the loss of history, both tangible and intangible. This happens through documentation of historic buildings and sites, and also their preservation. Designation also promotes restoration and adaptive reuse through collaborative design. A lot of interesting designs come out of preservation and adaptive reuse. One particular example I have here on the screen is Franklin School, which is now the home of Planet Word Museum. I'm sure many of you have been there. And that really came about because of preservation of this National Historic Landmark and its conversion to a new use. And then finally, designation also provides incentives, including tax credits, grants, and easements. And that's one of the most popular parts of preservation and what has helped make preservation so successful over the decades. Designation has also really become, a bigger news story in recent years as we've been contending with natural disasters around the world and including here in our country. Of course, last year there were the wildfires that burned the Pacific Palisades in Los Angeles and nearby Altadena. A couple years ago, or more than a couple years ago at this point, Lahaina, one of the most historic towns in Hawaii, a vast majority of the town was lost due to wildfire. And then cities like Newport, Rhode Island, and Charleston, South Carolina, they're facing, rising sea levels. So this shows the importance of place to people because when there's these landmarks and neighborhoods have been lost, there has been a really personal loss for people because they had attachments to these areas. But also surveying and documentation is important because then that helps us learn what we do lose in natural disasters. And unfortunately, I think this will just become all the more common in the coming years. So other reasons why we might designate places include for jobs, heritage tourism. Obviously, some of the most popular areas in Washington are historic areas, whether that be Georgetown or Capitol Hill. Preservation has been supported in the realm of property values and as spaces for startups and young businesses and tax generation. And of course, all cities aren't equal, right? DC faces challenges and has different opportunities than other cities. So it's important to keep in mind that these reasons are not the same throughout the country in every city and town everywhere. So I think if we're going to talk about designation, it's really important to just briefly go over the history of the preservation and the conservation movements. I also enjoy history, so I like having this more historical, chronological approach to preservation. But really, when you look at preservation in the US, a lot of people point to the early efforts to preserve sites like Mount Vernon. People will discuss the Mount Vernon Ladies Association stretching back to 1853. And it really shows how early preservation was focused on things like presidential sites, Revolutionary War sites, Civil War sites, those things, those big themes in American history, but also a very specific lens looking at American history and a very specific set of historic events. It wasn't very diverse, the approach to preservation at the time and what was considered important. Of course, many of you probably know that Yellowstone was established as the world's first national park in 1872. That was obviously a monumental um, event in the history of conservation and preservation. And then I want to just point out that in 1892, Casa Grande ruins, which you see here in the photo, and it's now a national monument, those were set aside by the federal government in 1892. So there was an early interest in Native American sites out west that went along with the natural landscapes that were being preserved, like Yellowstone and Yosemite. In 1906, Congress passed the Antiquities Act. This is the law that allows the president to create national monuments through executive orders. That's obviously shaped our landscape in this country and our national monuments and national parks, things like that. And then in 1916, as all of these new national parks were being established, the National Park Service was created. And really now in American historic preservation, the framework sits within and really comes from the Park Service. And we'll get back to that in a minute. So before 1966, and you'll see why in a minute, 1966 is an important year in preservation. But before that, the first historic district in the country, the first time planning and zoning was used for a preservation purpose was in Charleston in 1931. Shortly thereafter, in 1935, the Federal Historic Sites Act is passed. And this is really the first time that the federal government lays out and promulgates that preservation is one of the policies of the federal government, and that we need to be focused on significant or national significant history, that sort of thing, and sites associated with it. This law eventually leads to the creation of the National Historic Landmark Program, which really went into full effect starting in 1960. Also during this time, during the New Deal, the Historic American Building Survey was created. This program is still around. It sits within the National Park Service, and this has allowed for the documentation of many buildings in this country. It's also been really important in the documentation of buildings that have been lost. And it's definitely something to check out if you haven't heard about it before. All of the documents, or at least a vast majority of the documents, have been digitized and are available at the Library of Congress. So you can just type that in to the search engine. In 1949, as the federal government's getting more involved in preservation, Congress helps create the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that organization, or at least know the name. It's now an independent nonprofit, but it was originally created by Congress. Today, the National Trust, stretching back to then, but now today, it manages and operates many historic sites around the country, I think somewhere between 20 to 30. And it also gets involved in all sorts of different things, whether it's, preservation of Route 66 or African American cultural heritage, historic religious spaces, and just general advocacy. It's involved in many things. And it's really one of the most important organizations within American historic preservation going back to 1949. Now, coming to DC in 1950, Congress passes the Old Georgetown Act, and this creates DC's first historic district, Georgetown. Georgetown is now one of over 70 historic districts in DC. But with that said, Georgetown is still kind of this first among equals when it comes to historic districts, in the sense that it was created by federal law. So it's the only historic district that is more directly regulated through the Old Georgetown Board and the Commission of Fine Arts, which is very unique, where all of the other historic districts in the city are reviewed and managed by the Historic Preservation Review Board and the Historic Preservation Office. And we can talk, or I'll talk about that more in the coming slides. In 1964, the DC Joint Committee on Landmarks was established through the efforts of the Commission of Fine Arts and the National Capital Planning Commission. And this committee determined what are the most significant building structures sites within Washington, DC. It was an honorary list. There wasn't any power behind this, but it was the first time a group of individuals got together in the district and they said, that's a significant building, that's a significant building, and really acknowledging that. And that really is the beginning of the DC Inventory of Historic Sites, which is DC's local register of historic places. During this time, this is when Penn Station that you see here on your screen, this is when this was demolished. this is really seen as a turning point within the preservation movement. And out of this is where the New York City Landmarks Law comes about, and was really an important template in local preservation ordinances. And we're going to talk about DC's local preservation ordinance. But what happened in New York really shaped preservation throughout this country, especially at the local level. So the reason I kept mentioning 1966 is because in 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act was passed, and it's been amended since then. There were significant amendments in 1980 and 1992. So not all of this happened right in 1966, but this is what created the framework that we currently operate within. It dates to 1966, and this created this federal, state, tribal, and local framework. And we have a federal system, as you learned in U.S. government class, and the federal system also permeates our preservation program. So the National Historic Preservation Act created the National Register of Historic Places, which recently just reached 100,000 listings, I think in May of last year, May of 2025. The act also created the state historic preservation offices. So every state has a state historic preservation office and a state historic preservation officer. Eventually, through amendments to the act, tribal historic preservation offices were created in 1992. Specifically, the act also created the federal historic preservation process called Section 106, which basically says when there's a federal undertaking such as a federal appropriation or licensure, something like that, there has to be a review to see if historic sites that are either listed in the National Register or eligible for listing in the National Register, that's really key, if they are being impacted. And if they are being impacted or facing demolition, what is going to be done to correct that action? Some kind of mitigation has to take place. And the mitigation can be all sorts of things, such as setting up a grant fund or a website or a brochure or a walking tour or so on and so forth. But Section 106 is a really important tool within historic preservation. And it doesn't say something will not be demolished, but it basically says if something's going to be demolished or negatively altered or harmed, something has to be done to make up for that. And it allows this consultation process between the government, state historic preservation offices, and then other stakeholders that have a relevant interest in the project and the area. The law also allows for the creation of the Historic Preservation Fund, which funds the state historic preservation offices, the tribal historic preservation offices, and then various grant programs down to the local level and these certified local governments, which not all cities and towns are certified local governments, but many around the country have met certain standards to become certified local governments, and that opens them up to different kinds of grants and trainings and things like that. So that is something that a lot of local jurisdictions seek to become as a CLG. Over time, within a short period after 1966, the Secretary of the Interior's standards for the treatment of historic properties was drafted, at least the first edition, and it's still used today. This is the gold standard of what is called a treatment. The 4 treatments in American historic preservation. So you won't necessarily hear the same terminology if you're looking at preservation in Europe or Canada, but at least in the US, there's preservation, restoration, rehab, and reconstruction. And the one I want to focus on, just for our purposes here, is rehab. And according to the National Park Service, rehabilitation is defined as the act or process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions while preserving those portions or features which convey its historical, cultural, or architectural values. Rehabilitation and the associated tax credit, which was first created in 1976, and it was amended over the years, most recently in 2017. But this is a 20% federal historic tax credit for continuing use and adaptive reuse. And this has been used by many developers and properties throughout the country, and it's really shaped our built environment and promoted the use of, for example, the classic example being, a former warehouse building that's now a loft space, or you think about a warehouse building that's now a giant market hall, something like that. And, this kind of comes about in that context of the 1960s and 70s, where you're seeing this reuse of historic spaces, whether it's like Quincy Market in Boston or Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco. There's this new interest, and the tax credit supports this, but this interest in reusing our historic spaces rather than just tearing them down to build a new mall or a new shopping center. Why don't we rehab them from use as a new hotel or a condo building or office space, something like that? So I'm sure many of you can think of examples that you've seen here in DC or in your hometown or wherever it might be of this adaptive reuse. And there's a good chance that it has been shaped by the federal historic tax credit and or state historic tax credits. DC does not have a state historic tax credit, but many states do. I will mention that with the rehab, before we go to the next slide, the rehab has to be quote unquote a substantial rehab. And also it has to be for income producing properties. That is a really critical piece there. So it works well for a bed and breakfast. It's not going to work well for renovating your home that you live in. So that's an important piece to keep in mind. Also, designation tends to go hand in hand with a lot of rehab projects because you need to have that National Register listing to get the tax credit and have it certified. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears to the local historic preservation process here in DC, which I know many of you are interested in because you live in Washington and you want to hear how it works here in DC. So really, when we think of the framework that we use here in DC, it dates to the DC Historic Landmark and Historic District Protection Act of 1978. Now, I want to add that, for example, there was the Joint Committee on Landmarks going back to 1964. We had the Old Georgetown Act in 1950 before that. I'm jumping around here. In the sense that there was also in 1973, that's when a 180-day demolition delay was put in place. There was stuff happening, and those new processes, procedures, that influenced things, and the law from 1978 built on that. So the 1978 ordinance, which is our preservation ordinance, it doesn't just sit in a vacuum. There was context before it, but generally speaking, we live in this post-1978 ordinance world, and this is how the process works. So there is a historic preservation office with professional staff, and they support the Historic Preservation Review Board. The Historic Preservation Review Board meets every month, typically on the fourth Thursday of the month, except for August. And it's 9 members appointed by the mayor and approved by the council. The core of what they do is historic designation and design review. And within that, design review is the vast majority of what they do. This is reviewing alterations, new constructions, that sort of thing within historic landmarks and within historic districts. They also review, of course, like I said, designations, but that's not nearly as common as the design review that they do. That is the bulk of what they do. DC has a very strong preservation law in the sense that the DC Council does not have to sign off or review anything that the board does. That's not the case necessarily in other cities where the council does have a voice in preservation. In DC, that is not the case. Also, we have the DC Inventory of Historic Sites, which I briefly mentioned earlier. That is our local inventory. It goes hand in hand with the National Register. And the DC inventory, as I hinted at earlier, it builds upon the Joint Committee on Landmarks designations that happened back in the 1960s into the 1970s. But the DC inventory actually has regulatory power over these historic landmarks and historic districts, where the Joint Committee on Landmarks designations, they were only honorary. And the reason the DC inventory now has regulatory power is thanks to our 1978 ordinance. A really important piece here that surprises a lot of people is that property owner consent is not required to be listed in the DC inventory. Your property can be nominated and added to the DC inventory without your sign off. However, it is not the same for the National Register going back to 1980 when owner consent provision was added to the National Historic Preservation Act. So I also want to mention too, when you're looking at the DC inventory versus the National Register, the difference between local designation and national designation. And this is a really critical aspect of American historic preservation. And it's so critical, I wanted to take this quote directly from the Park Service. It says, listing in the National Register places no federal restrictions or requirements on a private property owner. You may do with the property as you wish within the framework of local laws or ordinances. This is so critical. So basically, it's saying that the National Park Service, if there is not a local ordinance against demolition or alterations or whatever it might be, the National Park Service, well, either way, the National Park Service is not going to come in and stop you from doing what you're doing. The teeth of the regulation in American historic preservation happens at the local level. And I think oftentimes there's confusion. People think, oh, it's the federal government, it's the National Park Service, they have the power. But when it comes to designation and control over design review, in America, that is all through the local level. So that is a really critical piece to understanding designation. The designation process here in DC. So I won't spend too much time on this because there is a lot you could go into, different facets of this. But basically, the main points I want to make are that a nomination can be submitted by property owners, agencies, including the Historic Preservation Office and the Historic Preservation Review Board, so government agencies, advisory neighborhood commissions, and community organizations. And the reason I have an asterisk there is the core mission of the organization has to be preservation or within that realm, right? So there's a lot of nonprofits that wouldn't necessarily qualify for submitting a nomination. Once it's completed, DCPL, we as our own best practices, we notify the property owners and the ANC, the relevant ANC. We then submit it to HPO after 30 days. And then once they accept it, notifications are sent out and it's given a pending status. And another way that DC has a really strong preservation law is that there is protection for pending landmarks. So pending landmarks are treated the same way as a actual historic landmark. And if something is proposed to that pending landmark, the case needs to come to the Historic Preservation Review Board to determine if the landmark should be designated or the property should be designated before any action can take place. That's a very significant and strong aspect of the DC preservation law. Stuff can be pending with the Historic Preservation Review Board for a number of years. It doesn't have to happen within a set amount of time necessarily. So there's been stuff pending for a number of years, but eventually a hearing will be scheduled and public notice will be given and it will go to the HPRB. At that stage, testimony can be taken from organizations like DCPL, and letters can be submitted by interested neighbors, the ANCs, so on and so forth. The Historic Preservation Review Board, through the advice of the Historic Preservation Office staff, which writes a staff report, they will determine if they want to designate the property or not. The staff report, which is published before the monthly hearing, it will either support the nomination or it will oppose the nomination. And the board doesn't have to listen to what the staff is saying. They don't have to agree with the staff report, but oftentimes they defer to the professional staff. So there's a supportive role between Historic Preservation Office and the Historic Preservation Review Board. Oftentimes, because DC has an interesting setup where our local preservation commission, preservation board, is also the same as our state historic preservation board, they'll make the decision at the same time that they add to the DC inventory to also forward it to the National Park Service for inclusion in the National Register. So that's why there's that arrow there. So now I want to talk about something that's really important, but I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but it's important to know about it. There is an appellate process. I said that the Historic Preservation Review Board, their decisions aren't reviewed by the DC Council, which is correct, but you can appeal if you are opposed to a particular decision that was made by the board. The DC Office of Planning says, the mayor's agent has the final authority to determine what is in the public interest under the DC Historic Preservation Law. In some cases, the law requires a public hearing before making this finding. There are typically no more than 5 to 10 such hearings per year. So the mayor's agent is this appellate, this appellate process, this appellate court, basically. And this is usually for cases of demolition of a historic landmark or contributing property within a historic district. Unreasonable economic hardship, that's really important. It is recommended that preservation ordinances have this within the language of the preservation ordinance because there has to be some kind of off-ramp or safety valve or whatever term you want to use for the economics of the situation. This gets into takings and a very famous decision called Penn Central. We're not going to talk about takings tonight, but there has to be some kind of option as far as economic hardship goes. So that is something that could be included in an appeal. And then DC has this interesting thing called special merit, where basically a project could be considered so beneficial to the community and DC at large that it trumps the designation or the decision of the HPRB. So we're not going to discuss this any further, but I did want everyone to know that there is this appeals process. So historic designations in DC, we have over 800 sites listed in the DC inventory. This also includes, more than 27,000 contributing buildings in over 70 historic districts, so a large amount of buildings. And then 23 of these landmarks also have designated interiors. By and large, preservation is focused on the exterior of buildings, but there is an option to designate interior spaces. DCPL has nominated interior spaces before. We don't do it very often, but we have. And so there are 23 landmarks here in the district with interiors that have been included in the designation. There's over 600 National Register of Historic Places listings. And then there's 78 National Historic Landmarks. National Historic Landmarks are the highest level of honor a building or a structure can get within the United States. This process involves the decision-making of the Secretary of the Interior, and there's somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 of these. So I said there's about 100,000, or there is 100,000 as of last year, listings in the National Register, and then there's 3,000 or so in the National Historic Landmark Program. So you can see that to receive that designation, it really is a rarity and something that's really special. And there's surprises of things that are listed in the National Historic Landmark Program, but generally speaking, it's really significant stuff. And when you see the listings, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I want to mention that just because something is designated and it's a landmark, a historic district, that does not mean that change cannot happen. Change happens all the time within historic district. It happens all the time to historic landmarks. And that's why we have the design review process. And I'll mention that in my closing tonight. And designation does not regulate use. That's a really important piece. And it makes sense considering how much of preservation is built around the reuse of spaces for new uses, right? So use is generally viewed as an aspect of zoning. So it's important to make that distinction within preservation. And of course, if you're interested in these 800 plus DC inventory listings and these National Register listings, you can definitely check out historicsites.dcpreservation.org. We also have a cell phone app. And this is continually updated with the newest landmarks and historic districts here in the city. So what do you designate? We've been talking about designation. I've been saying, generally properties, buildings, structures, but technically, according to the National Register, you can designate buildings, structures, objects, sites, and districts. Now, how do you even determine what building structures, object sites, and districts are significant, right? Well, that's why surveying and evaluating is so important. And there's this quote I really like that I came across in a book, and I wanted to include it here. It says, surveying is the essential first step without which historic preservation is impossible. Nothing can be preserved unless it is known to exist, nor can an adequate case be made for preservation. And I said earlier when I was talking about, the disasters in places like Los Angeles or Lahaina, they knew what was lost because there had been surveying, evaluation, documentation, designation, but really all of it's built on surveys. And a really key component of surveys are these historic context statements and studies and multiple property documents. And these will look at certain themes, communities. Right here you see women's suffrage movement in Washington from 1848 to 1973. DCPL in collaboration with the DC Historic Preservation Office, we just did a context study on DC's Latino community. These documents, these studies, these will look at particular, like I said, themes, communities, types of buildings, and it will come up with, a historic context that will support future landmarking of sites, but it also typically lays out a list of potentially eligible properties to be added to the DC inventory and or the National Register. So as you talk about designation, which is the core of my presentation tonight, you have to remember that designation is really built upon all of this work that's going in on the front end towards surveying and evaluating sites. And a lot of sites will be surveyed and evaluated that are never added to the DC inventory or the National Register, but they'll lead to some sites typically being added to those inventories. So both of the programs that I've continually mentioned tonight cover historical and architectural significance, integrity, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Integrity, you'll hear preservationists talk about integrity a lot, and historical perspective. Now, what exactly is historical perspective? Well, in this particular instance, I'm going to rely upon National Register Criteria Consideration G. And this is a particular rule generally called the 50-year rule. And this is a special requirement that properties have to meet if they're built within the past 50 years or the significance within the past 50 years. And it says, listing possible for a property achieving significance within the past 50 years if it is of exceptional importance. So generally speaking, a site, some time has to have gone by before a site is really considered eligible or a building is considered eligible and significant. And it's not to say that something built within the past 50 years or an event within the past 50 years isn't significant. It just is saying that it has to meet a special requirement. It has to meet a higher standard. So that is what is meant here by historical perspective. So you can see here, both have these significance criteria. DC inventory has A through G, the National Register has A through D. And I want you to just see how they do match, even though the DC inventory is, it's a larger criteria or a longer criteria, I should say. It does match up with the register. So you see how events in history becomes A within the National Register event. Individuals becomes person within the register. Architecture and urbanism, artistry, work of a master, those become design construction within the register. And then archaeology is the same as information potential in the register. So, when DCPL is nominating a site or a building or structure to the DC inventory, we have to meet at least one of these criteria on the left, and we have to meet at least one of these on the right if we also want to have it be nominated to the register. And so you'll often hear preservationists talk about criterion A, and they're often referring to historic events and historical event significance based in the National Register. There's also criteria considerations, A through G. Those are those special requirements I talked about. That would include like the 50-year rule. So if you're nominating a site for its architecture, but it's from 2000, you're going to have to meet criteria consideration G, for example. Other ones that can sometimes be harder to nominate, but are still possible through the criteria considerations are properties that have been moved and reconstructed properties. Those are just particular kinds of examples that are worth keeping in mind when you're thinking about significance, when you're thinking about integrity. And then also, this is where it gets a little confusing. A site can be listed in the National Register for local or state significance. It can also be listed for national significance. But a lot of stuff in the National Register, surprisingly, is really just local or state significance. Hence why you could look at a register listing across the country from a small town in, say, Nevada, and you would say, I don't necessarily know who this person is or what this history is or what this architecture is. And that's probably because it was listed for local significance. So writing a landmark nomination, here's an example of one on the screen. There's two main parts I always tell people. There's the narrative description, which is the first part, and that's basically the architectural description. And there's the statement of significance, which is the historic context. And you can see how if there's already been like a historic context study done that I was talking about a couple slides ago, how that would help with your statement of significance in your historic context. Now, to make things doubly confusing, as I like to say, the DC inventory uses the National Register form. So, this form you see on your screen, regardless if the property is ever going to be listed in the register, DCPL and every entity that's nominating a property, at least here in the district, uses the National Register form. That's not to say other jurisdictions might not have their own forms, but in DC we use the National Register form. Now, I talked about statement of significance and historic context. This is the section that tells the story of the building or site and explains why it meets one or more of the significance criteria. Remember, I talked about the DC inventory criteria and I talked about the National Register criteria. And in the National Register context, that's A through D. That's the event piece, the significant individual, the design and construction, and the archaeology. You just have to meet one of those. The most popular ones are A, event, and C, design and construction. And you could have just criteria A met, or you could have both A and C met. You have to see what is your strongest argument for significance for a property. Areas of significance, there's many. They can be architecture, commerce, ethnic heritage, industry, religion, social history, transportation. That's just a small selection. Period of significance and significant dates. This is something that could be discussed for a long time, and trying to come to the determination of what is the start date and what is the end date. Now, if the building was completed in 1930, that's an easy start date. But really, the challenge becomes, where's the cutoff date? That's something that a lot of preservationists will argue back and forth about, is what exactly is the period of significance? Also, a significant date, for example, can be when a specific event happened, an event that's so significant it supports your significance statement, or say an addition was added in 1937 or 1940, that could also be a significant date. So this is the focus of the nomination, but relevant history before and after that period should be mentioned, but in less detail. So just because your significance ends in 1950 doesn't mean you have nothing to say about 1950 to 2026. You should at least add some additional context. Statement of significance, summary paragraph, the main argument, the key points. This is really your argument piece and why you're nominating what you're nominating and why you're nominating it for this particular criteria. Narrative statement of significance. These are additional supporting paragraphs and they're continuing to make your argument. Now, integrity, which I mentioned a moment ago, this is often referred to as really the authenticity aspect of a property. And just to quote the National Park Service, because I want to use just their direct quote, they say, historic integrity is the ability of a property to convey its historical associations or attributes. So the character defining elements of the building, say the building had like a porch, or it had a particular kind of gable roof, or a landscape with a particular designed garden. These elements support the significance of the property. And you have to ask, why is this property significant? And then once you know why this property is significant, that supports really the key features of the property, the physical pieces that support that significance. Integrity boils down to 7 aspects that have been laid out by the Park Service: location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. So feeling and association, those are kind of their own thing, and they're important, but those are kind of up to interpretation to an extent. Location and setting. Was the property moved? Was the farmhouse moved 5 miles away to a different area? And also, is the farmhouse still in the middle of a farm? Or is it now next door to a gas station, as the landscape has changed? These are the different things you have to think about, and you have to think about how they've affected they've affected the integrity of the property. Oftentimes when people are talking about integrity, they talk about, would a historical figure who's associated with the significance of the property, would they recognize the property today? Or have, like I mentioned, the location and setting changed so much? Or another thing that would affect integrity, especially if you're looking at architecture, is if materials have been lost and replaced by newer materials. Say, clapboard siding was replaced by vinyl, or the windows were replaced by vinyl windows, or there was the loss of that workmanship or the design. It's been totally remodeled and a section was taken off. So you can see how the physical really connects to the significance, and they have to support each other through these aspects and then through the criteria. But it's important to remember, integrity does not equal physical condition. Integrity doesn't mean beautiful. It always comes back to the significance. And as the Park Service says, the ability of a property to convey its historical associations or attributes. So that's just something to keep in mind. But yeah, I do definitely want to emphasize that physical condition is not the same as integrity. Okay, other considerations as you're writing your nomination draft for designation. You got to consider function and use, both historic and current. If it was a church in the 19th century, is it still a church today? It doesn't matter one way or the other, but you got to determine what has happened to the space since the beginning, which should be relatively easy. Architectural classification, which is the style. The Park Service through the National Register, they have a list of numerous styles for you to choose from that you'll enter into the form. What are the main materials used? You got to know who the architect and the builders are, if possible. It might not always be possible, but for many buildings and structures here in the district, it is. Boundaries, you got to look at how should the boundaries of the landmark be drawn, how tightly they should be drawn around a building, or how broad should they be drawn. Obviously, if you're nominating a landscape in addition to the building, that's going to create bigger boundaries. So those are the kinds of things you have to think about, and it's actually not as easy. It's easier said than done, I should say. You're going to have maps and photographs, of course. You got to document it beyond words. And you're going to use all sorts of sources. And you're going to use books and magazine and newspaper articles, pamphlets, building permits and deeds, census records, directories, historic maps and photos, etc. It's not just going to be, academic sources from libraries and archives, even though those are important, but there might be really significant information from a pamphlet from the 1870s or the 1880s. So you have to be open-minded about your sources, but also using solid sources. And they can be found both online and then also in person at libraries and archives. National Register publications. I've mentioned how the National Register talks about, areas of significance and, architectural classifications, things like that. And you can find this in the National Register publications. We're really lucky that the Park Service and the National Register, they put out a lot of really helpful information as you evaluate properties, as you research a property, and then how you complete the form. And there's numerous publications online. And all you have to do is just type in National Register publications and these will pop right up. So finally, a property is designated. So what does that mean? Well, that's when the design review piece kicks in. And we at DCPL believe that design review produces smarter design that is appropriate and compatible and accommodates change. You can see right here, this is a picture of, on the left, this is a picture of the U Street Historic District. And you can see that it's really vibrant. And you can also tell that like a lot of changes happen here. It's not like, as they often say, frozen in amber. Change has happened here. And, a lot of it is compatible. And then you also look at this picture of an apartment building and a new addition up in Cleveland Park. You can see how the new construction is compatible, how it, it looks modern and it has its own look, but it matches with the old building. It's compatible with the old building, but also different enough from the old building. So it doesn't look, it's not tricking you to think that that addition was built at the same time as the original building. And those are the kinds of things that architects, developers, preservationists, those are the kinds of things they look at when they're looking at design review. Compatibility, according to the DC Historic Preservation Office, includes color, details, height, materials, ornamentation, rhythm, scale, setback. So when you're looking at this apartment building, for example, on the screen in this image on the right, you can see how, they paid attention to things like color and detail. When you look at, the different panels and the different window, the different fenestration, and then also, things like scale and setback, things like that. So these are the different facets that are reviewed when design review takes place. So it's important to mention that permits are not required for routine work. This includes things like painting. That's a question I get sometimes, so I wanted to point that out tonight. When a permit is required, a project impacting a historic landmark or a building structure within a historic district must be reviewed and approved by the Historic Preservation Office. And then, as I mentioned in the very beginning of the presentation, Georgetown Historic District, thanks to now the 1950 Old Georgetown Act, falls under the jurisdiction of the Commission of Fine Arts and the Old Georgetown Board. And then there's various resources for property owners, including the HPO design guidelines for some historic districts, and then there's topics that are just citywide, regardless of what historic district you are in. So design review comes down to major and minor work. Minor work includes things like in-kind repairs to masonry, roof replacements, quote unquote, unobtrusive alterations, and smaller additions. And these are approved and reviewed by the Historic Preservation Office staff. One thing that might surprise people is that a vast majority of approval and review happens at the staff level. In the grand scheme of permits that are reviewed and alterations that are reviewed, in the grand scheme of things, very few are actually have to go to the Historic Preservation Review Board states. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. HPRB review, of course, would include things like new construction, larger additions, significant changes, and quote unquote incompatible minor work. So I guess if you have something in this first column on the left and it's viewed as incompatible, then you're going to get bumped up to HPRB. But it's important to remember that a lot of what happens is going to happen at the staff level. And of course, if you don't really know if your project is minor or major, or you don't know, for example, if it's quote unquote routine, I always recommend contact the Historic Preservation Office. They're more than happy to talk to you and to help you. And they have different staff reviewers for different historic districts and landmarks. So they are more than happy to answer your call or your email. With that said, before I close out tonight, I wanted to mention that next week we are going to have an overview of DC's design review process with Todd Jones at the DC Historic Preservation Office. And I like to think that Todd's going to pick up where I left off, because I talked about, surveying and evaluating and how that leads to designation and listing in the DC inventory in the National Register. But then once something's designated, what happens next? Well, that's when design review kicks in. So Todd's going to have some great information about how it's relevant to you as a homeowner. So that's next Wednesday, January 21st at 7 p.m. on Zoom. And you can register at dcpreservation.org/calendar. And like tonight's webinar, that will be free. So I definitely wanted to give a shout out for that. So thank you so much. It's been fun talking about designation. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to email me at zach@dcpreservation.org. So thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.